Hello again. Hope you're doing well, keeping safe and sound, and of course staying indoors. I'm happy to get back to you this soon with the second poem that we have in our syllabus. The second poem by Yeats, The Second Coming. Well, it sounds to me like a very timely poem to be reading just now. Its apocalyptic message, the end of resources and the exhaustion of the means of a whole epoch in the history of humanity, and the state of fear, anguish, and that the world is living in right now due to the coronavirus bears a lot of affinity to the state of chaos and the ending times and the apocalyptic event that Yeats refers to in, or at least evokes in the poem. As usual, we start with there is a set of questions on the poem and a reading of this poem together. So I choose this time to have 3 different sets of questions, each including 3 to 4 questions. So we have about 12 questions in all. The 3 sets of questions are first the historical context and background of this poem. The second set is a close textual analysis of the poem, the stanzas. And the third set of questions cover a formal analysis of the poem, that is, things about meter, stanza form, rhyme scheme, and so on. So let me start with a reading of the poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? This poem being what it is, it would be, of course, inconceivable to read it without having an adequate idea about its historical context and background. This is a necessary prior reading for the simple reason that it is a reprise, it is a particular use of the biblical literature around or on the second coming of Christ. The second coming of Christ is known among Christians worldwide as that great event which will save the world after its second fall, second demise. And the second fall, that is the ending times or the end of time, will be marked by the advent of Christ, the Savior, Jesus the Savior. But prior to his coming, the world will witness the coming of an Antichrist. It's a biblical prophecy figure which is terrifying and intriguing, that this biblical literature announces as a false prophet who will in fact mark the two millenniums, these the 2,000 years of Christianity, and he will launch a new epoch of chaos, of large-scale cruelty, of the extenuation of the people. Of course, the Christian Bible points to the extermination of the Jews, but the Jews are Christians and they can stand in the biblical literature for any people, any nation with faith, it could be Muslims, it could be Jews, it could be Christians, and that this ending of times, which in biblical literature is called the Great Tribulation, with the reign of biblical prophecy figures such as wicked soldiers or the beast, the Antichrist, or the false prophet. There's even reference sometimes in the biblical literature to the great harlot. A harlot is a wicked woman or slut, and the great harlot in the biblical literature refers to or stands for an attractive, alluring, seducing power. It could be a nation, it could be a system, it could be anything. But the rule of these terrifying figures will be short-lived, because the real Christ will eventually come, and this is what is meant by the second coming. The real Christ will come with his own army of saints, and he will fight the Antichrist and his army, and have Satan, a fourth figure, biblical prophecy figure, have him chained at the bottom of hell for 1,000 years, and then the real Christ of the second coming will create a kingdom. It is called the kingdom of heaven, and it will last 1,000 years. That is a new millennium. You notice how the 21st century is called the new millennium, or the third millennium. It's because with the end of the 20th centuries, 2,000 years or 2 millenniums have ended in Christian time, not in Muslim time. One of the questions in my first set of questions is about Yeats' theory of gyres. And I think it would be an interesting idea to relate it to this biblical literature about the second coming of Christ. In fact, we've seen a bit of this theory with sailing to Byzantium, but just a bit of it, because here in this poem it is more consequentially elaborated, and it translates Yeats' system of apprehending the world as outlined in his book A Vision. One way of defining this theory of gyres is pointing to the way Yeats conceives of history as a movement of gyres, or circular motions, or spiraling turns, or reels, or reeling motions. All these terms are sometimes used in his poems. So he conceives of history as a movement or a gyre whose shape is that of a vortex or cone spiral. That's the geometrical shape of the gyre, with the idea that the modern times, that life in the 20th century is in fact a very fast, ever-widening motion that loses control of itself, so much so that the falcon cannot hear the falconer anymore. We will talk about the art of falconry as one of two main images or symbols in the poem later on. But to go on with Yeats' theory of gyres, gyre stands for this circular motion ever widening and getting out of control, but it also represents the larger cycles of history, or what we call the millenniums. Yeats, in fact, believed that the orderly gyre that began, or cycle of history that began with the birth of Christ and lasted 2,000 years, that is 2 centuries, was ending in chaos, murder, and large-scale cruelty. And that is, as I said before, what the biblical prophecy calls the Great Tribulation. An Antichrist will advance on the earth with his army. And it is his army that is referred to in the poem as the beast. This beast could be an army of soldiers, a powerful nation, or the most powerful nation on earth, made of false believers or Christian believers who have totally distorted the teachings of the Christian church. It could also be an ideological economic system, say capitalism or communism. Or it could be that great harlot that I named just now as being a seducing and attractive, huge organization or system or whatever. For instance, globalization. Okay, so that's I'm trying to make correspondences between the biblical prophecy literature and contemporary notions that we know about. So that the Antichrist will rule over the believers, Christians, but also, I suppose, Muslims and Jews, and spreads cruelty and chaos, killing most of the saints or believers. And this is referred to this period. No one knows how short, how long it is. Sacred texts refer to it as a day, as an hour, but nobody really knows about its time span. So this period is the most agonizing, the most terrible period in the life of the Jews. Well, this period is supposed to come to an end by the coming of the real Jesus, the real second coming, with his army of saints. Jesus and the saints will come in what is known as the real second coming. They will fight the Antichrist and the beast, that is, the Antichrist and his army of soldiers, of wicked soldiers. He will also fight Satan and have him chained to the bottom of a pit in hell for 1,000 years. So both beast and Antichrist will be destroyed by the will of God. They will totally dissolve, and Jesus Christ will then start a 1,000-year-long kingdom called the Kingdom of Heaven. At the end of which, and so biblical prophecy go on and on, that at the end Satan will erupt from the bottom of the pit at the end of his chaining, and that he will try to, and these epochs, great epochs, are millenniums, or what Yeats called gyres. The beast is one of two main symbols in the poem, and this is part of the historical context and background of the poem. The second main symbol is inspired by the art of falconry. You know what is falconry? The art or the game of training birds of prey to follow instructions in hunting contexts, but not only. Just now in contemporary times, drones, you know drones, those little machines flying in the air, little airplanes, small mini aircrafts, following instructions from remote controls, and doing both in the army, for public services, sometimes markets, using them to deliver provisions and food to people, or armies using them to kill very remote targets in population, or destroy targets, buildings, and so on. The falcon stands, the relationship between the falcon and the falconer stands for the relationship between humanity and civilization, or humanity and the machine, or humanity and globalization, or humanity and the pace of progress it is going with. In the second line, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. That is, this relationship is interrupted. It used to be under control, but now the control is lost, and the falcon cannot hear his master. The connection between humans and machines has been severed, and this severance produces confusion, breakdown in communication, but of course it creates also chaos and confusion. As a result of this breakdown in communication, things fall apart. Things are falling apart. I think this phrase has been used by an African writer as the title of their novel, and you're supposed to find who it is. So things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Whatever epicenter used to hold the world, the earth together is now lost. So it is unable to hold. There is no balance. There is no equilibrium, and it's all turning round and round and round in a widening circular motion. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. Notice this image of a seashore marked with blood. So there is as much blood as there is water in the ocean. And everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Ritual of innocence is drowned. It's all prayers, all religious rituals, all rituals of the sacred, all innocence is drowned by this sea of blood. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeah, well, those who know best are not motivated, so they just are totally indifferent and they let go. And the worst, that is, the evilish ones, are taking hold of things and they are governing the world. In the second stanza, we notice something like a change of tone, a change of attitude, a change of tone in the speaker's voice. Surely some revelation is at hand. More aggressively sure, but perhaps more aggressively cynical, because the attitude is very ironic. So surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. That is to save us from this chaos. The second coming. The exclamation mark is supposed to impart a tone of cynicism, of utter despair onto the phrase. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi. Spiritus Mundi is Yeats' phrase for the collective soul of the universe. So a vast image out of this collective soul troubles my sight. It distracts my sight. Somewhere in sense of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. The shape with lion body and the head of a man is in fact it's symbolic of civilization, but it stands for the Sphinx. That is for a mythical creature that was a Sphinx or Manticore. These are two mythical creatures that are said to be predatory towards humans, to kill and to devour humans. And of course, the effect of this sentence, of this image of a shape with lion body and the head of a man, is that nature is going wrong. something is really, a whole cycle of life is turning bad, is turning wrong. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. So in spite of having the head of a man, this being lacks moral sense and judgment. It is pitiless, it is undiscerning, it is Machiavellic, and it has a one plan, which is massively destroying humanity and the earth for his own benefits, for their own benefits. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. So a shape is moving its slow thighs. Oh, it's an animal. While all about it, reeling, this is a verb. Shadows of indignant desert birds reel around or all about the thighs. Real shadows of the indignant desert birds. It is the prey birds. The prey birds are the army, the wicked soldiers following this beast or this evil companion. The darkness drops again. By darkness is meant the darkness of a whole epoch. عصر من الظلمات. الظلمات is it's mental darkness, it's spiritual darkness, it's physical darkness, but it's darkness surrounding humanity. The darkness drops again. Notice how it drops upon the world. So another age of darkness starts again with the coming of this beast and the Antichrist. Of course, there's no reference to the Antichrist because Yeats has taken some elements from the whole biblical scenario and he has dismissed others, so that now we are concerned with the beasts, with this army of soldiers or whatever is in the service of a divine monster or Antichrist. But there's no reference to this Antichrist. But now I know, goes on the poem, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep, the 20 centuries are the 2,000 years of Christian civilization. And of Christian civilization, that is a European or a world civilizations where there is a Christian ethics, a Christian mode of life. It is now come to an end. Notice how those 20 centuries of stony sleep, that is, they have come to mean nothing. They are in a state of sleep like stones. Christianity over these 2,000 years has turned into a blank, a white Christian mythology. Remember the title of Jacques Derrida's essay? It has turned a white mythology, Christian mythology, stony, in sleep, silent, with no impact on the world. So I know now that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. They were vexed to nightmare. They were struck awake. They were made to react somehow or other. They were vexed to nightmare, but they were awakened not to daylight, not to something positive, though vexed to nightmare. Vexed could have a number of synonyms. That is, they were made really bitter. They were vexed. They were made. They were awoken to. They were re-motivated to. They are in fact made to react to things, to nightmare, that is, to the extent of a nightmare, by a rocking cradle. And the cradle is the cradle in Bethlehem, is a reference to the birth of Jesus in a cradle, a rocking cradle. That is, there's someone already there in the cradle being rocked by their mother. But who is it? Who is it? And that's the ending question. What rough beast in its hour comrade at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Certainly not Christ, but an antichrist, but a beast. Slouches is moves, with difficulty, on hands and knees, in a beastly way. Okay, so the final question is really asking about what is going to happen now that the world, that life on the earth is threatened by a beastly phenomenon of one kind or another. We may interpret this beastly phenomenon, as I said before, as either a system, a nation, a powerful nation, an evil leader, somebody like Trump. Anyway, but what resounds with the two last lines is a feeling of anguish and fear of what will happen next in the world. Well, I think I have repeated myself in this first section, but it's if I ever did, blame it on my concern that you get an adequate notion about the biblical prophecy literature and Yeats' use of it, and some other elements vary on the historical context and background. But I think that I have stepped onto the second section of my analysis, and I have produced a summary of the poem, and an explanation, but at the same time a kind of summary. So please do a summary of your own, and I'll move now to the next point in my textual analysis, to the speaker of the poem. Yes, just before and with regard to the occasion of the poem, I think that the date of the composition of this poem and its publication are highly evocative of the occasion of the poem. It was written in 1919, and that's really the aftermath of the First World War. So probably the Second Coming is Yeats' serious meditation on what becomes of humanity, what shall become of humanity in the aftermath of the First World War, which itself can be seen as one of the different interpretations of the beast in the poem. Okay, so as regards the speaker of the poem, I'm tempted to see speaker and tone together, because I think that there is no specific indication as to the identity of the speaker in the poem, but there are certain signs. There are signs as to his persona and his perspective. And these signs, in fact, abound in the poem, but they are particularly manifest. They abound in the poem in the choice of qualifiers, of the adjectives, the adverbs, surely, and also the diction, the type of diction and the range of diction. There are certain sound effects like alliteration and assonance, but much more. There is a lot more of alliteration than of other sound effects in the poem. Anyway, there is a particular tone, and there's a shift in tone, a shift in tone from stanza 1 to stanza 2. First of all, I would like to define tone, just in case you are not familiar with this term. Tone is the analysis of the speaker's attitude in language, his attitude towards the object of his description or his inspiration. So tone is a matter of the attitude translated of the speaker or the poet, if they happen to be one, towards what they are talking about in the poem, what they are evoking in the poem, the object of their evocation or description. Okay, so with regard to the speaker, I noticed that there is no hint really about the identity of the speaker, but there's certain signs as to the role, so the persona that he is given in the poem, and his perspective. With regard to the perspective, I would like you to notice the shift in perspective between the first stanza and the second stanza. The perspective in the first stanza is a very neutrally descriptive one. It reads like a news bulletin with no presence, no intervention from the speaker. But as soon as we move to the second stanza, the tone becomes more subjective, more assertive, and more committed. So what we have is a more subjective perspective, really. Notice the use twice of the adverb surely. Notice the punctuation, which in fact develops more. What we have is an explanation mark, which in fact is much more forceful, either cynically or otherwise, but it's more assertive. Okay, so there is so the perspectives moves from that of a neutral somebody to that of a more assertive and more committed someone who is in the know, who knows what he's talking about, and he has got even the capacity to foresee, to foresee visions and to foresee signs and so on. So what we have is the perspective of a seer, of a visionary, rather than of a, say, a lover or a landscape painter or anything. Okay. With regard to tone, what I notice in the second stanza is a highly skeptical tone. Highly, perhaps skeptical is a bit more strong, is stronger than ironic, but they range within. I mean, they may be classified within the same range of attitude. They're ironic. So what I notice is a highly skeptical tone in the irritated impatience of the speaker. It's as if the speaker is wondering whether there is a second coming or not, or if the next one is different from the many second comings that have happened in the history of the Christian tradition. Probably there are in the tradition many stories about the Antichrist, what we call in the Islamic tradition a Dajjal. So there is the literature, the religious literature or tradition is full of these stories about second comings that have happened in different periods of the Christian tradition. So the tone is one of irritated impatience. The second coming. Well, it's like as if the poets were wondering, well, even if there is a second coming, how different would it be from the previous ones? So there is this hypothesis. There's also the hypothesis that even if there is a second coming, well, is there an Antichrist coming at the same time and the beast? So if Jesus was crucified on the mountain of Olives, Jebel Zaytun, that's where he made his last apparition. So how can we guarantee that he won't be crucified a second time? Anyway, or either way, the tone is very skeptical. It's very ironic. Notice also, and this time I want you to notice or to read the ironic tone throughout the poem. Notice how gradually in the poem, the premonition, the premonitory tone is growing more in probability as the beast itself is moving its slow flights and slouching towards Bethlehem to happen. And also the premonition is growing in probability as the poem grows to an end. Notice the organic metaphors within the alliteration at the end of the poem. What rough beast its our comrade at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The be in Bethlehem to be born. It is the alliteration here is highly significant and is highly pertinent because it marks also one of the levels of the growing of this premonition, that in fact the premonition is growing in probability, and it's the probability of a savior, of a Christ coming, dies in degree as the poem itself grows to an end, and as the beast is slouching to Bethlehem to be born. Okay, so what we have all around the poem is the increase of the beast in shape and in movement, and the decrease, okay, the gradual decrease of good sense, of hope, of meaning, and so on. So what we have is a very, very pessimistic perspective all through. What I have said just now about these this simultaneous increase or growth of the beast and the depth or entropy of meaning. I like the word entropy. Entropy, look it up. The entropy of, that is the depth of sense and so on. So my idea here is that this simultaneous growth or increase of the beast in shape, in mobility, in happening with the gradual entropy of meaning, common sense and truth, is indeed one of the main aspects of modernism in this poem. And I think that I like this poem best when I compare Sailing to Byzantium with the Second Coming. I think I find the Second Coming much more daringly, much more boldly, modernist. It is more experimental with form, with technique than the other poem. And we shall now see how this ironic tension that I detected in the poem, and I hope you will detect it too, we shall see how this ironic tension between, in fact, maintaining the two actions, an increase and a decrease. There is a tension maintaining these two. We shall see how this ironic tension operates at the level of form and meter. And I take you to the final set of questions on this poem, to the formal analysis. I will here concentrate on two aspects of form, the stanza form that Yeats apparently used, and the meter. And in both, or at both levels, we shall see how, in fact, Yeats is using recognizable forms and rhyme schemes and so on, but that he makes the ironic tension pull at these linguistic and poetic techniques to the point of breaking. So what we have is language put to breaking, to a breaking point. And I would, even if you were able to perhaps make sense of this last point, I would even say that this constitutes the move towards a meta language that Yeats uses. That is how poetry, in fact, puts itself into question. But I think this last idea is too advanced, so we will just try now to detect this ironic tension on these two levels, the level of stanza and stanza form, and the level of meter. So let me once again read the poem so that you have the two stanzas fresh in mind. Tourney and tourney in the widening jar, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. See with me this line? It is very iambic, isn't it? Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. This one too. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere, this one much less, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Notice with me, the stanza is 8 lines long, isn't it? It's as if we had 2 quatrains. There is no rhyme scheme, so we should look for an unrhymed pentameter, and it is in fact the meter that Yeats is using is blank verse. That is unrhymed iambic pentameter. You know it. Okay, let's move on to the second stanza. Some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. And we could read on until the end. And in fact, the stanza is 14 lines long. What does that bring up to your mind? What verse forms are 14 lines long with 3 quatrains and a final couplet? It is the sonnet form. Okay. Anyway, I'm not the only one to think that William Butler Yeats seems to have had the sonnet form at the back of his mind. And in this poem, he's putting to test the linguistic limits of the sonnet form. In other ways, he at the same time uses the sonnet form, but he proceeds to put into test the lyrical mode of the sonnet and the rhetorical structure of the sonnet. I explain. So stanza 1 is an octet, and the octet and sestet is in fact one of the two main verse forms, and it's the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, while the Shakespearean sonnet is the 3 quatrains and a couplet. So we seem to have both variants of the sonnet form that are used, but they're not used literally. They're played with, they are experimented with. So stanza 1 is an octet, stanza 2 is a 14-line stanza reminiscent of the 14-line sonnet form. However, we notice how Yeats marks his breaking, that is, intentionally and consciously breaks with the sonnet tradition on 2 different levels. First, at the lyrical mode of the sonnet, you know that the sonnet is a lyrical form, which is, at the hands of Shakespeare, very discursive, because it announces an argument, it develops this argument, and it creates a conclusion. Still, there's always a lyrical speaker somewhere in the sonnet. So its mode is lyrical. And we see here Yeats breaking up with the lyrical modes of the sonnet. The second coming reads as an almost dramatic. There's an action going on, isn't there? There's a beast moving towards, slouching towards Bethlehem, becoming more visible, taking full shape. So it's an almost dramatic in the sense of being visual and happening as we read the poem. The second coming is an almost dramatic portrait of the apocalypse, that is the advent of the Antichrist. So that's the first, the lyrical mode is disposed of. Secondly, Yeats also breaks up with the rhetorical structure of the sonnets. You've read sonnets in the 5th semester, I suppose. Well, while the sonnet is discursive, as I said before, there's an argument, there's a development through imagery, there's a conclusion at the end, the summation of the couplet. So while the sonnet is discursive in this sense, Yeats' poem is an ironic visual representation. That is, we see something, we see it with our eyes. We don't think with our minds, we see it. There's an ironic tension that functions between telling and showing, and I think that this is one of the paradigms, in fact, of modern literature, that it shows, it refuses to tell, of modernist literature, generally speaking. And we see Yeats here making full usage of this aspect of modernism. So the ironic tension between 2 poles of representation, what is shown and what is told. The ironic tension between a lyrical mode and a dramatic mode. This ironic tension is very modernist. It is not classical. It is not Renaissance. Good. So far for stanza form. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. And we move on to meter. When you read the poem and reread it, you will notice that it's written in blank verse. And blank verse, as you probably know, is unrhymed iambic pentameter. You can try yourself, read it, and try to reproduce the iamb or the iambic feet. You will see that sometimes these iambic feet function with a great deal of measure in tone and meter. For instance, lines 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 in stanza 1. they fit beautifully the metrical scheme that is the iambic pentameter. While the other lines, the other three lines in the first stanza, are marked with severe variations. This is moving from iamb to trachea and so on. What is the effect? There's always an effect when the poet, who knows very well about the grammar of poetry, who knows when he is using a trochee, when he's using a spondy, and when he's using an iamb, he's not doing these things unconsciously. So when he produces these variations, these alterations, is always for an effect. And I think that the effect here is to hint already, that is at the level of stanza 1, at the picture of chaos and confusion coming up in stanza 2. And when we move to stanza 2, which we said before at the level of tone, do you remember that it's more assertive, that there is irritated impatience, there's almost growing despair as the poem moves on. Okay, I think we can feel the same tension, the same negative tension operating at the level of meter. This time we are thinking meter. So, for instance, lines 13 to 17, that is when the vision takes place, these lines are very unstable. The stresses are very inconsistent, moving from iamb to trachea, and doing the iambic pentameter one way or another. The lines sometimes go wild. They're long or they are short. There is enjambment. So they go wild at moments. The effect again. What is the effect? Whenever you are undertaking a formal analysis, your two primordial moves is to identify the formal technique and to analyze it and to describe its effect. There is always an effect, and what we mean by effect in poetry is the meaning. What is the meaning intended here? I think the meaning, or we could say that the meaning at the metrical form of the second stanza is Yeats' intention to that is to show the beast taking action. So the beast in the speaker's mind seems here to be testing the limits of the poet's cage. You can imagine the poem as a cage, you know. You can imagine the beast as a caged animal, but he's pushing and straining at the metrical edges of the poem because he lives in language and he wants to go beyond the language. He's walking beyond the language, and at the same time he's bringing the language to breaking points. He's bringing it to breaking points. This is where I think this is the end or the extreme of interpretation at which I'm tempted to say that there is a meta-poetic dimension to this text. That is that it's at one level of interpretation we sense Yeats, in fact, putting the language of poetry and the poetic form to test. That is experimenting with their limits, with the limits of the sonnet form, with the limits of blank verse, with the limits. So, all in all, the meter in the poem, essentially, that is essentially blank verse, is constantly menaced with chaos and with entropy, with the death, and the very end marks this traumatic birth of the beasts, and how it comes at the expense of meaning, at the expense of common sense, and the expense of poetic form. This is a great poem, and I just love it. I hope you do too.